My biological father was an alcoholic, late nights out partying and drinking with buddies and infidelity.
What was that process of forgiveness like for you in particular?
I was always searching for male approval, so my identity was always wrapped up in who I was dating, how serious the relationship was.
What did you observe in the young people you were leading who did come from like divorce or dysfunctional families?
Maybe one misconception is that if the divorce feels more amiable, then maybe it was a low conflict situation. The kids don't really suffer, that they'll be fine. Just remember that it does always affect children. Always. I think kids who come from broken families are in large part in danger of seeking relationships that are not healthy for them.
Is there any lessons or advice that you've learned when it comes to kind of navigating step-family, step-parents? Welcome to the Restored Podcast. I'm Joey Ponarelli. If you come from a divorce or a broken family, this show is for you. We help you heal your brokenness, navigate all the challenges, and build healthy relationships so you can break that cycle and build a better life. My guest today is Brandy. Brandy currently serves as the executive director of a nonprofit called Chastity Project, a ministry that's dedicated to inspiring teens and young adults to embrace and live out authentic love and the virtue of chastity. Before ministry, Brandy enjoyed over 2 decades of leadership in public education. She wore many hats throughout her career, including teacher, instructional coach, assistant principal, and director of communications, among others. Brandy earned a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies from Texas A&M in College Station, followed by a master's degree in education leadership from Texas A&M in Texarkana. She also holds certifications as both a Texas principal and superintendent. And outside of her professional life, Brandy is a devoted wife to her husband, Dan, and a proud mother to their 4 children. Now, when Brandy was just a few months old, her parents divorced due to her father's alcoholism. And from the outside, her story ended up looking like a best case scenario. She was raised by a really courageous single mom and later a kind stepfather. But underneath it all, she carried wounds that no one could see. She believed that perfection was the path to love. She feared becoming like the very people who hurt her. And one wound even stayed hidden for 20 years. And so in this episode, we explore all of that, plus how our wounds from divorce, from abuse, from absent parents certainly shape us, but they don't have to define us. We talk about the shocking memory that resurfaced in adulthood for her and what it revealed, how being the good kid can actually be a trauma response, and the hidden impact that divorce can have on children, even when it's handled well. We talk about why her marriage should have failed statistically and how she and her husband beat those odds and have built a healthy marriage. And finally, what her mom did right that every divorced parent needs to hear. I'm really impressed with her mom. And so if you felt pressure to be perfect, you feared repeating your parents' marriage or kept wounds hidden, this episode is for you. Now, in this episode, we do talk about God and faith. And if you don't believe in God, you're totally welcome here. This is not a strictly religious podcast. So wherever you're at, I'm glad you're here. If you don't believe in God, my challenge for you is just to listen with an open mind. Even if you take out the God parts, skip the God parts, you're still going to get a lot out of this episode. And with that, here's my conversation with Brandy. Brandy, so good to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Joey. I'm excited to be with you today.
I want to dive right in. I'm excited to learn more about your story. I know bits and pieces of it, but to hear it cohesively, I'm really looking forward to. From what you remember, what you were told, what was life like in the months and years before your parents split?
So my story is, well, I don't know how unique it is, but unique to most of the kids that I could relate to when I was younger who had experienced divorce. My parents divorced when I was just a couple months old. So I don't have any memories of what was going on at home. So I can only just relate what I was told. My biological father was an alcoholic. He, praise God, has been in recovery for a long, long time now, but he was an alcoholic. And so, all of the things that come with that, late nights out partying and drinking with buddies and infidelity and, just all of the emotional, really abuse, for my mother that she endured by not having an equal partner in their marriage, somebody that she could depend on and rely on. So it was quite volatile, as I understand it. And my mother, once I was born, she said she knew immediately, that she could not raise me in that environment, that it was not healthy for me, also not healthy for her to stay. And so she would often pick me up and sort of head out the door, and he would be home and she would be explaining to him that she needed to leave. And he would take me from her and say, well, you can leave, but you can't take her. And so, of course, my mother wasn't going to leave me behind. So she would stay. So, and I think that's, probably relatable to a lot of women in situations like that. They have children, they have, they maybe rely on their partner for income. And so my mom had nothing. I mean, she had no college degree. She, just really didn't have anything. And so she would stay. And then finally, one day, by the grace of God, he came home, as I understand it, and was intoxicated. And she said, I'm going to leave. And he allowed her to leave. She tells the story that she explained to him in a very calm way that, if he didn't allow us to leave, if he could think through what my life would be like and how I might grow up to hate him because of what he had put us through. And so that was the turning point for him, that he decided, I guess in that moment, that he didn't want that to be the case, that he didn't want me to grow up hating him. And so he allowed us to leave. And so while divorce is never a good option for anybody, in this case, it was, really probably my mother's only option because he was not willing to change. But yeah, it was quite volatile.
Okay. Yeah. And you're so young, and that makes sense that something needed to change, something needed to happen. And wow, no, I mean, I can't imagine what your mom went through. And that's something I think, with age and whatever level of maturity I've been able to acquire, I have definitely tried to put myself in my parents' shoes more to understand what they were going through. So that's beautiful. You've been able to do that. It sounds like you've had some conversations with your mom at least.
Yes. And that's been, when we can talk more about this later, but one healing piece for me has been that my mom has always been open to conversations, about questions I may have. So that's been really good. My mom and I are close, so that helps.
Oh, yeah, no, that's wonderful. And especially like you said, if it's before your explicit memory, like your cognitive memory develops, then you won't be able to pull those images up, but your body remembers, like you went through those experiences. So it's definitely helpful. I found for sure to have someone who's able to relay that. And one maybe point here, and I know we could talk later about this, if your parents are unwilling to talk about this, maybe there's someone else in your life who can. I remember learning a lot about just like the family dynamics and my parents' families through relatives, through aunts and uncles. So I think that's a good tip if someone's thinking like, well, I can't have that conversation with mom, or I can't have that conversation with dad for one reason or another. Is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. As a former educator, I mean, I for sure tried to make sure that I was speaking into the lives of children who might have been, going through the same things, and felt like that was one way that God could use me in that career, and had a number of conversations with kids when they would, be upset about something going on in their family with regard to divorce or parents fighting, and tried to just listen, but then relate to them that you're not the only one, and we could talk about it, and I would share my story, or, whatever bit of my story was appropriate. So I do think that's really important for kids of any age. I mean, even into your adult years, being able to talk about the things that happened. That's huge.
Huge. Yeah, because when you bottle it up, it doesn't lead to great things, which we could talk more later about. But I'm curious, as a principal, as an educator, like you said, what did you observe in the young people you were leading who did come from like divorce or dysfunctional families, like highly dysfunctional families? And yeah, were there any kind of go-to tactics in addition to what you mentioned of like having conversation, offering empathy that you would use?
Yeah, well, I would say this, and I think you've talked about this on the podcast quite often. Maybe one misconception is that if the divorce feels more amiable, between the two parents, and maybe it was a low conflict situation. So I think the misconception that comes along with that is that the kids don't really suffer, that they'll be fine. And I think most people probably would have thought that about me because I was so young. Oh, she'll be fine. She doesn't, there's no real trauma from this. But I think that's important for adults to just remember that it does always affect children, always, regardless of, even in a situation like mine where it's really for the good of the family, when there's abuse or something involved, it still, leaves kids with questions in their minds about who they are and what part of it they played. And so I think, one, just being open to discuss things with children is really important. And then the other thing that I think is really important for parents to remember, if I could just give advice to parents, and that's just not to use your kids as a pawn, in a divorce situation, because I've seen that time and time again, where the kids are sort of caught in the middle of it all and trying to sort of be the adult in the situation And that does not serve children well in any way, shape, or form. And so, I mean, I often just would be frustrated wanting to tell parents, like, grow up and be the adult, you've made your choices, but now you've got to be sensitive to your children's needs. So that's really important. But yeah, just having, making sure that every kid has a relationship with a caring adult is huge, huge.
That is huge. Were there any trends that you've seen? I know you've listened to and seen research on this, but I'm curious if you if there are any like anecdotal stories or just trends you notice with the young people that you were serving who came from the what we call broken families compared to the kids who came from healthier, intact families.
I mean, the kids who came from intact families and families who, I mean, sometimes families can be intact, but then things are not good at home. So, but kids who came from, really strong families, where both mom and dad were really involved and helpful to the children and had good relationships with the kids, those are the kids who really excel. They don't struggle to build relationships with others. That attachment theory, comes into play, and they have the proper, they know how to attach properly, to the proper people. I think kids who come from broken families are in large part in danger of seeking relationships that are not healthy for them, whether that be that they are, more at risk for abuse when they're younger, or even when they're older, seeking out relationships that are not healthy, because they have not had that good experience with what a healthy relationship looks like. So, I mean, I think there's just all kinds of dangers, if you will, for kids who come from broken families. And again, that's why it's really important for the adults in their lives, to really be cognizant of that, and do the right thing by the children as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And it often requires looking beyond your own pain. But without going further into all of that, and thank you for weighing in kind of from that role as like the principal. I'm curious. So you mentioned you were just months old when your parents split. And then how old are you now, just for the context for everyone? If 48. You're okay.
Yeah. Okay. 48, almost 50, inching towards 50.
Nice. Okay. I don't think I'm supposed to ask a woman how old she is, but we have to on the podcast. And then, so obviously you couldn't have learned about the separation and divorce when you were younger, but do you remember maybe having conversations with your mom or even your dad as you got older and kind of understanding what was happening and what family life was like in a divorce situation?
So my mom, I think I said this, was really good to always be open to conversation around any questions I had, which was great. So from my earliest memories, I can remember having conversations with her. Now, and I keep saying biological father because my mom later remarried, and I have a fabulous stepfather that I don't even really consider my stepfather. I've always just called him dad. So, but my biological father was in my life to the extent he could be. He had visitation. So, there would be conversations with my mom around that, when I was going to go with my dad and what we were going to do and those sorts of things. I don't know how young I was when my mom explained, his alcoholism and all of that. But I remember from a very young age, I have this really concrete memory of being on the playground at my elementary school. Like I could close my eyes and still be there. And looking at my friends who had intact families. And even though I, at that point, was in a really good situation with my mom having remarried, I still wondered, what would it be like to have, your mom and dad, your biological parents married? And I remember just looking at different friends and thinking about, what I would see in their homes and what that might be like, almost fantasizing about it. But like I said, my mom was always really good to have open conversations with me if I had questions. And I'll tell you one thing she did that was so powerful. She went to visit a psychologist when they divorced to ask for advice on what do I say to her? My mother really, she would tell you if she were here, she didn't really want me to be around my dad. She was fearful of what that might bring and what I might see and be exposed to. But the psychologist gave her really good advice, or at least I think it was really good advice. And that was to never say anything negative about my dad, to let me discover anything that I might need to discover on my own. I mean, obviously in a safe way. You wouldn't want to put a child in an unsafe situation. And so I remember from a very early age, there would be situations where he would take me for the weekend, and it wasn't anything, bad. It wasn't a bad situation, but he was just very different. And, I would feel uncomfortable and not myself in whatever situation that we were in, visiting friends or, or what have you. And still my mom persisted, even when I would come home and I might have, complaints, if you will, about whatever went on over the weekend. My mom never said anything negative about my dad. And she would continue to say, you have all the best parts of him. And she would point out, yeah, it's beautiful. She would point out, makes me emotional. She would point out like things like I was a very studious child and she never really was all that studious, but my dad was. And so she would point out things like that and say, see, that's from your dad. You got all his best parts. And so, that was just a beautiful, healing experience, I think. And I didn't even recognize, at the time what was going on, but that was obviously, really a positive piece that she employed.
Yeah. I love that because, as you know, so often parents can fall into, saying things like, you're just like your father, you're just like your mother, and getting into those like spats, which, I've seen time and time again in and out of my family, with the young people that we work with. And yeah, so I think that's like a really beautiful tactic to actually call out the good. Wow, I really, really like that. And I hope we can, if that's okay with you, we will use that moving forward. But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, okay, so good. I'm curious, like with the visitation, and again, I love that tactic too of your mom, like without putting you in danger, letting you kind of discover for yourself. That makes so much sense to me. Yeah, I'm curious what visitation was like for you, from what you remember. Did it continue on as usual? What was that like? Because as you know, everyone listening has been through something like that. So I'm curious what the experience like that was for you.
So my mom and stepfather had primary custody and my dad just had visitation. And until I was about 6, I believe, he lived in my hometown. And so visitation was very easy and he would just come and get me for the weekend. And now, of course, this was after he sobered up, mom didn't allow him to take me, when he was drinking. But so I think I saw him off and on when I was very, very small, but probably at my grandparents' house. His parents were just some of my favorite people. I have really good memories of his parents, even though his father was an alcoholic and that of course contributed to his own alcoholism. My grandmother was just what I would say. She was a saint. And so I loved being at their house. So I think I spent probably a lot of time at their house for visitation, which was great. My mom totally trusted my grandparents. I don't think at this point my grandfather must not have been drinking, or she, wouldn't have, allowed me to go. But my grandparents were wonderful. And so we would go there a lot. So there were happy memories of visitation there. But then often we would be, at his apartment and, with his friends and things like that. And I just never felt really all that comfortable, sadly. My dad I also have really vivid memories of him being really hypercritical of things. And so, where my mom was always really positive about him, my dad would say things like, oh, your nails are filthy. Why doesn't your mother clean your nails? And my nails were not filthy. My mother took very good care of me, And so he was always a little more critical of me, of my mother. And so I think that also probably, made things more uncomfortable. So that continued until I was about 6 and my grandparents passed away within I think it was probably a couple of months of each other. And so at that point, my dad moved away. And so then visitation became a little more infrequent. And I guess I would say, and I certainly don't say this to be judgmental of my dad. I think I want to preface with just saying, he came from a broken family as well. And I think he did the best he knew how to do. He just never really found a lot of healing, unfortunately. But I would say he would often jump in and want to be kind of a father when it was really convenient. And so like he would want to come and maybe get me for 2 weeks, to spend some time with him in the summer. And then he would make big promises, about, oh, we're going to stay in touch or what have you, and then that would fall by the wayside. And that's really continued even today. I am still in touch with him, but he doesn't live anywhere near me. And he even today will make a big promise about wanting to have regular phone calls or whatever. And then he just can't commit to it. And I just think that's all from his own brokenness, and I just don't hold that against him anymore. There's just been a lot of healing there. Praise God.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I'd love to talk more about that. Well, thanks for going into the visitation stuff. I wanted to talk a little bit about this kind of pattern that you recognize at some point with, okay, alcoholism runs in the family, brokenness runs in the family. Was that a big fear of yours? I'm sure we'll get into this further, but Is that something you feared, the alcoholism, repeating the brokenness, dysfunction?
Yeah. So I think a huge part of my brokenness from the wounding was this tendency to perfectionism. So I always was quite a bit of a rule follower anyway, but always seeing like performance, equals love. And I think a lot of that came from the fact that my dad would come around for things like my dance recital because he wanted to, tell all of his friends, oh, that's my daughter on the stage. And so I think I saw that. So there was this perfectionism. So I was always a rule follower. But in high school, I never took a sip of alcohol because I was terrified. I mean, just totally terrified that if I took even one sip, that I might also be an alcoholic. So it played a huge part. I mean, and maybe that was a good thing that I didn't drink in high school,
Yeah.
but also I don't think staying away from alcohol because of that fear is healthy either. Yeah.
Fair enough.
But
No,
it's,
that totally makes sense. Yeah, no, and I think that's probably one of the biggest like felt pains and fears that our audience experiences is just like, I don't want to become like my parents, or I don't want to like fall into the same vices, or I don't want to, just repeat the relationships that they had. And so definitely I'm excited to talk more about that when we get into relationships a little bit more. I'm curious if there's anything else you would add about, yeah, just I guess life as a kid growing up in that environment. We've already covered it quite thoroughly, but I'm just curious if there's anything else that you would add.
just more maybe add a little bit about my stepfather, because that was also very healing to have a father figure. So he stepped in when I was also very young. I don't have any recollection really of life before him. And just never, I mean, I never felt like a stepdaughter ever. And have two siblings from, that marriage. And they never felt like step siblings to me. I mean, we've never referred to each other in that way. And so that was, that was really healing too. And I think I've shared this with you just briefly before, but I think this is important to share because obviously the goal of the podcast is, to help somebody out there who may be going through the same thing. So, had this great relationship with my stepfather, and his father, though, was also, funny enough, an alcoholic. So there was a lot of dysfunction in his family as well. Of course, I wasn't cognizant of that as a child, but later, I think I was probably around 4, there was some abuse by my step grandfather. And I remember being very aware of what he was trying to do. My mom had always talked to me about, dangers with other people. Mainly, I think she was afraid of who my father might take me around. And so I was very aware of, of like, you got to tell somebody, thank goodness.
Yeah.
And,
Good.
so I remember thinking when he went when that first happened that I needed to tell somebody. And I remember wanting so badly to tell my mother, but this is a product of divorce. My mother had already been divorced once. And because this was my step grandfather, I was afraid. I remember thinking this so vividly. I was afraid that if I told, my mother would take my side. I had no question that she would believe me and would handle the situation the way that it needed to be handled. But I wasn't sure that my stepfather would believe me. And so I kept that quiet until I was an adult. And so because of that, then he was allowed to abuse other people, because nobody knew, nobody put a stop to things. And so as an adult, those memories were repressed until I had my own children. And I remember when those memories started to surface. I remember telling my husband, Dan, I'm not sure that I woke up from a dream and I thought, was that a dream or was this real? But I knew in my soul it was real. And so about that same time, some other abuse victims were coming forward and this was starting to surface. And my mother knew about it, but she didn't know that I had been abused. And so there's I won't go into details about the story about how it all came together because it's really not relevant, but it's just the Holy Spirit, planting all of that at the right time so that all of the stories, came together at the right time and were able to be addressed. And we were able to go through some family counseling and have a lot of healing around that. But again, I think when I think about my parents' divorce, I think a lot of people thought one, I was so young that there would not be repercussions. And two, I had this wonderful stepfather, and no memory of life before him, without him. And so I think most people would have dismissed it and said, well, she's just a really resilient child. There's no reason to worry about, whatever the repercussions of the divorce would be for her. And here I was abused, and there's a repercussion of the divorce I'm afraid to tell. And so I think that's really important too for adults to remember, that it doesn't matter, what the story is. There are always repercussions. The children have wounds from that divorce. And so it's just important to remember that and be sensitive to that.
Okay, real talk. If you've been trying to get in shape so you feel better physically and emotionally, but nothing is working, you're not crazy. I've been there myself. I recently read a free guide by Dakota Lane, a certified personal trainer who we've partnered with, that's helped about 1,000 people, and it was really helpful for me personally. In the guide, he breaks down the biggest fitness mistakes that we all make, like undereating, overstressing, or focusing too much on the scale. And he gives really simple, practical tips that you can actually use, that you can implement today. And so if you're tired of feeling like you're never going to get in shape, just click on the link in the show notes and grab the guide today. It's totally free, and it might just be the thing you need to start feeling healthier physically and emotionally. So good. Thank you for sharing so openly. Just to, maybe give people the context. So remind me, how old were you when that happened? And then how old were you when it came out?
Yeah, so I was about 4, I think.
So 4, okay.
Thinking and remembering it correctly, about 4 when it happened. And I was really fortunate. It wasn't consistent. It happened one time, and, praise Jesus for that. But like I said, the abuse continued with other victims after that. And I was, let me think. How long did John was about... Our oldest son was about 2, so I was probably 24, so like 20 years later when it came out. 23, 24.
Okay.
Never had one thought of it before, that morning that I woke up from the dream and had the conversation with my husband.
Totally. No, you were so young, and it's just so fascinating how the mind of like a little girl or a little boy could reason to that level of like, I don't want to share this with mom because I'm afraid that the divorce will happen again. We'd go through that all again. Man, it just breaks your heart to think of that. And even as good of a job as your mom had done to like make sure, she had open communication with you. So it's definitely, I think, a wake up call to parents, to everyone, that this is, a serious thing that has, like you said, repercussions that maybe are hidden that you can't really put your finger on.
And sometimes I think too, Joey, because I was on the outside appeared to be a really resilient child, which really was because of this perfectionism. So I was a high performer in school, my grades were always good. I made friends, with other children easily. So there wouldn't have been those telltale signs that there would have been any distress. Most people would have just moved on to it, they wouldn't have worried about me. And so I think that's just, just a wake-up call to adults who are involved with kids in any way, whether you're mom and dad or, grandparents or aunt and uncle. If you love children and they've been through any kind of trauma, it's important to have your eyes on them at all times and look for maybe even things that are not your telltale signs, and have open conversations for sure.
No, I love that. And I think that's one thing that I noticed in myself and my siblings, like we became really good at like hiding things.
Yeah.
And sometimes out of self-preservation, protection, other times just like you had mentioned, not to like rock the boat and keep things as peaceful as they could be. So I do think you need to, obviously have the good relationship to where if they want to talk to you, they will, but also maybe probe a little bit and ask questions that can kind of get to that. So I know maybe we're talking a decent amount about parents, but I think this is helpful overall, especially because we have people listening who like one day want to be parents, or maybe they are new parents and they come from a broken family, and they can, perhaps apply some of this even if they themselves are growing like a really beautiful marriage and family itself, because these principles apply, I think, across the board.
Absolutely. And I would just say too, or even if you're not in the place, at this point to be married, maybe that's still a goal in the future. But, if you have hidden things, even at, like I said, 23, 24, you can't really heal unless you bring things to the light. And so, I can't imagine now, 24 years later, if that was still hidden. There would have been a lot of missed opportunities for healing. And I can't say where I would be, where the other victims might be. While it was hard to talk about that, it was important, really important to talk about it and to bring it to the light. So I would just say, like you said, sometimes children of divorce learn to hide things really well for whatever reason. But even if, you are 24 years old, it's not too late to bring that out into the light and talk about it, with somebody who loves you and cares about you and can help you heal from it.
Love that. No, that's such a good principle of healing that, like you said, bringing it into the light. And then also, don't be afraid to kind of have those difficult conversations or say the things that are uncomfortable. I heard someone say that like you're, usually like one difficult conversation away from like some incredible healing and growth, one conversation away from, leveling up, whatever that might look like in whatever area of life. And I think it's our unwillingness often to have those, to push through the discomfort and, just be courageous in those situations that often keep us stuck and hold us back. So I love everything you said there. Thank you for going into that. I'm curious, you mentioned perfectionism. You mentioned, just not wanting to rock the boat. I'm curious if there were any other ways in which kind of you were affected, and especially if you notice, like, when did you have an awareness that there were these things in your life that, you went through, came from a broken family, you went through all this dysfunction, there are other things that happened like you shared. Did you kind of come to this awareness? You mentioned on the playground, but I'm curious if there was anything else.
Yeah, I think, just having those thoughts off and on, as a child and then as a growing, adolescent and then teen, just sort of longing for what would that be like. But, as you grow and you get busy and you get involved in different things, I think I was probably less aware or less concerned, maybe, if you will. But I didn't recognize, really what it was doing in my life. Like I didn't, the perfectionism and this need to always be a peacemaker, I didn't really see that as a negative in any way when I was, because it was praised, it was always praised. And so I didn't see that as a result of trauma really until I was an adult and I had my first child. So really kind of about the same time that all of the other, was coming to light, I was really starting, the Holy Spirit was really starting to do some healing work, I think, in my soul by just slowly, bit by bit, bringing some of those things to light, with me and just helping me see those things, as woundedness so that you can heal from them. So I would say it was, becoming a mother. Wow. I mean, and then watching my husband he's a fantastic dad. And, here we've been married for, almost 27 years,
Beautiful.
And so seeing like, oh, this is what, a functioning, intact family looks like, and watching him be a father, I think that brought back a lot of the wound, or brought up a lot of woundedness in me. And so, it was in my adult years, when I really started to see those things as woundedness. And I would say in my teen years too, and then like early adult years dating, I didn't see this as a piece of my woundedness then, but I do now. This idea that I was always searching for male approval, so my identity was always wrapped up in who I was dating, how serious the relationship was.
Sure.
I mean, I can look back and just see that as a trend, from about age 15, maybe even younger on, Yeah.
No, that makes so much sense. And I can relate on the opposite end of like seeking, female approval. So I think that's a common struggle. And thanks for sharing that. No, everything you're sharing just makes so much sense. I'm curious if there were any emotional problems you struggled with or bad habits that you wanted to share. And then in a little bit, we'll talk about relationships, but any emotional problems, bad habits.
The habit would be that, I think, jumping from relationship to relationship, and just seeking approval in that regard and wrapping my identity, in my relationships. That for sure became a really repetitive habit of mine. And I think that's probably, that was probably the most destructive thing that I did, as a result.
No, that makes sense. And I think it points to, I think, probably a lot of your mom's influence on you, because one of the things that we have often shared on the show is that if you have a good relationship with one or both of your parents amidst these, really rough situations of divorce and just high degrees of dysfunction in the family, there's a good chance that you're going to be able to cope pretty well with it. And so that's really beautiful. I mean, your life could have looked very different. And so it's amazing that
I've often thought about that. Like, what
Sure.
would life have looked like if she had not had the courage to walk away? Or
Yeah.
even when she walked away, if my stepfather had not come into the picture, what would our life have looked like? And it would have been vastly different, So, yeah.
Yeah, no. And even just the ongoing like relationship and parenting that she provided you, it's just beautiful. And even on the step parent side, that's such a mixed bag for a lot of people. A lot of people's experience of step parents isn't very good, if we're honest. And so it's really beautiful you had that. And not to, I don't mean to throw any step parents under the bus. There are some very good ones like you experienced, especially if you're listening right now. Thank you for being a good one. But yeah, so that is so interesting. I guess is there any lessons or advice that you've learned when it comes to kind of navigating step family, step parents? I know you were so young, like you said, so it kind of felt like there wasn't a step family going on there. But I'm just curious if there's any lessons to someone listening right now that you'd want to pass along who's maybe dealing with a step mom, step dad, step sibling, step family situation.
Haven't really thought about that. I think it's just really important from the adult perspective to just work well together for the children's sake. I think honoring as much as you can what the children's desires are. I mean, I know when they're little, it's hard for them to know what's best for them, for them. But, I think being flexible with visitation and just avoiding as much bickering and fighting as possible from the adult perspective. For a kiddo, gosh, I think, as much as possible, if you can look for the good. And I think that's true in a lot of situations, negative situations. If we look for the good, often we can find it,
Yeah.
even from really dark places, maybe just being open to finding some good, even if the relationship with your step family is difficult, just trying as much as possible. But then I also think if it's an unhealthy relationship, when you're old enough, you have to set some boundaries. I think that's really important. You're not made to be a doormat either, So, yeah.
That's good. No, and I don't need to put you on the spot with that, but that's
No,
great
that's
advice of like setting the boundaries, especially once you have like more independence, and obviously always set boundaries, but when you're younger, it can be hard. But once you have that independence, I totally agree. And in some cases, that means, I'm never a huge proponent of this because I think there's a lot of healing and growth and forgiveness that can happen. But if if it's so toxic and you need to cut them out of your life, maybe that's the case. But in most situations, I think there's the possibility of working towards rebuilding and, at least slowly, step by step, growing a better relationship. But I love that advice about the boundaries. And then also you made me think of just this whole principle of in life, in every relationship, like whatever we praise in other people will almost always get repeated. And so I think there's something really good and beautiful about that, of like praising the good things that we see, even if there's like a lot of bad, like praising the good. And then hopefully that, they'll become more and more like that good person that you're making them out to be. In the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie talks about that, about how it's really one of the powerful tactics of like influence is giving people a reputation to live up to. And so if you, kind of pull out those good qualities, those virtues, and and without being dishonest, you kind of paint this portrait of like, that's your true identity, or that's who you are, then typically, especially if you're in a position of influence, that will motivate them more to stay true to that, to be consistent with that image that's being portrayed of them. So I think that those are really beautiful lessons. And thanks for talking about your step family. Before we move on, anything you'd add?
No, I would just say you're so spot on about the words we speak over people. Gosh, I often would talk to my teachers, about that. I mean, and I think that's true if you have any influence on anybody, whether it be a child or an adult, speaking, like you said, honest words of affirmation, not the corny stuff that's not true, but really speaking the words of affirmation and calling them to be their best self is very, very powerful.
I love that. I was having a conversation with my dad recently. It was a text exchange, and we were talking a little bit about the past, and without going too into it, that was like kind of a situation like we're describing, where I was able to kind of affirm him in some of the things that he, did right. And obviously there was a lot of brokenness and things that didn't go right. But I think there's something good about that, being able to kind of pull that out. And again, not shying away from maybe having the difficult conversations, because we did talk about that too. But, and we have had conversations like that, but I think there is a lot of beauty to pull out the good. So super good. Thank you for going into all that. And yeah, that book, if anyone's interested, How to Win Friends and Influence People, will teach you a lot about it. And one of the things I think he says in that book too, just to your point, is when you give compliments, when you affirm people, the more specific, the better. General compliments don't typically land super well with people, and you always want them to be sincere. You never want to flatter. And so I think those are like great principles as well, to whether you're dealing with a stepfather, stepmother, siblings, or anyone in your life. I think those are good principles across the board. I want to talk a little bit more about relationships. So you mentioned kind of this, I don't know if we'd call it a relationship addiction, like you were jumping kind of, compulsion, whatever, from relationship to relationship. Was there anything else like in your relationships in which ways in which you struggled, or just anything you eventually had to outgrow, whether it's in your teen years or as a young adult?
Maybe I would just talk more about like wrapping your identity in that.
Sure, please.
Because, and that was something, gosh, I would say probably wasn't all that long ago. I mean, really relatively short time period ago in my adult years, when I really recognized what that was, and I know that our whole audience is not necessarily Christian or Catholic, but I am. And so my identity, understanding that my identity comes from Christ and who I am in Christ, and not from who I'm dating or even, wrapping my identity in what I do or who I'm married to or, who my children become, because that can really become a nasty pattern. And it really did for me, because once I was married and secure in my marriage, well, then it was, like, oh, my identity is in my job, or, identity in my children and how well they perform. And so I think that was tough, because it does become sort of a habit, and it becomes, just a repeatable thing that you just sort of, once you leave it behind in one thing, you just go searching for it somewhere else, And so I think that's really important, just, you got to know who you are, independent of all of those things. Who are you at your most authentic self? And that's hard. I mean, that's a really hard question to answer, but you kind of have to get outside of all the noise, I think, to figure that out. So for me, that was a very spiritual experience, might not be for somebody else, but for me, it definitely meant, really growing in my relationship with Christ to figure out, who am I?
Beautiful. Okay. And it was through getting to know God better, building that relationship, that you got to know who you were.
Yeah, for sure. Lots of prayer, lots of scripture. And I think too, Joey, because of, that there's a lot of deep father wounds there for me, I think that's another reason why growing in my faith, the Holy Spirit was so gracious to take that really slow with me and to allow me to develop in my relationship, my identity to God as my father in a really slow, easy pace. Because that's hard. I mean, when you don't, even though I had this great relationship with my stepfather, still do, I mean, he's fabulous, there's still a wound there, a father wound there, that, your biological father failed you in so many ways. And so how do you relate to God as a father? Again, that took, a lot of years in my adulthood to figure that out.
I'm sure. And I think a lot of people listening right now feel the same. And was there, like you said, it was gradual, but I'm trying to understand, was there anything that maybe you haven't mentioned so far that was really pivotal to kind of overcoming maybe any barriers or resistance to that relationship with God as a father? Because it is a really hard thing. I definitely struggled with that myself, and still do to some extent, but have made a lot of progress like you as well. So yeah, I'm curious if there's any like pivotal moment or anything in particular that helped you make that shift. For countless teens and young adults, their parents' divorce is actually the most traumatic thing that they've experienced, but so many feel lost and alone in navigating the challenges. I've been there myself. It's really not easy, and it shouldn't be this way. My book, It's Not Your Fault, guides them through those challenges by helping them put their pain into words and begin to heal, work through the emotional problems that they face, cope in healthy ways instead of falling into bad habits, improve their relationship with their parents, navigate the holidays and other life events, and build healthy relationships, and so much more. One Amazon review said this book is packed full of really practical help. If you come from a broken family, or even if you don't, but you love someone that does, this book is so helpful. I can't recommend this enough. By the way, it's a quick read and it doesn't need to be read cover to cover. Since it's in question and answer format, you can just read one of the questions and one of the answers. And so if you want to join the thousands of people who've gotten a copy, just go to restoredministry.com/books to get the book, or download the free chapters. Again, that's restoredministry.com/books, or just click the link in the show notes.
I think probably a lot of the shift happened when I was able to forgive my dad for, his shortcomings. And that came about just in lots of prayer, scripture. I have a fantastic spiritual director. I've had fantastic priests come into my life, that I've been able to counsel with. I've had some counseling, probably not as much as I could benefit from, but some. And so my mother actually told me this story, and it was actually, her mother was very staunch Irish Catholic, and my mom's father died when she was 6. So my grandmother raised 8 children by herself. So she had to be tough, had to be tough. And my mom grew up kind of feeling like her mother, my grandmother, was a little bit blind emotionally. So she had a counselor one time say, if your mother was blind, would you still love her? And my mother said, well, of course. And she said, well, she's a little bit emotionally blind, to your needs. And so that was really healing for my mother. And she happened to share that story with me. And I think that was really important to being able to forgive my father, because I just recognized that, he's coming from lots of woundedness as well. I could be wrong. I don't want to judge his relationship with Christ in any way, but I don't think he's church going, or, I don't think he has that spiritual component so much to lean on like I did. So I don't think there's been a lot of counseling and things like that. So I don't know how much healing he's done. So I would just say, I just don't hold him accountable for that anymore. I did, but I don't, because I think he did the best he could do, with what he knew, with what he had known his whole life. And I've watched him jump from relationship to relationship. And so I just think, there's just a lot missing for him. And so I think my ability to relate to God as Father really changed when I was able to forgive my own father, for the woundedness that he caused.
That's really good. And yeah, no, I could definitely see how that would help so much. I'm curious, was there a particular moment, like what was that process of forgiveness like for you in particular, if we can get a little bit more granular, like, when did you become aware that this would be a good idea? Were there certain steps you took? Was it something that was kind of like you made this declarative statement of like, I forgive you, and then I don't know. Yeah, but talk me through all that.
So I think the process really started, again, going back to when I became a mother, like I talked about, and watching my husband be this incredible father. So somewhere in there, I began to have a desire, to forgive him. And I would just say this about forgiveness, because I know that's hard. That's hard when somebody has caused you a lot of pain. Forgiveness, though, is really, while obviously it's helpful to the other person, I feel like forgiveness is so good for the person that's holding all the pain, because it allows you to release all of that, and let go of it. And so I would just say, like, if you don't do it for the other person's sake, work through that process for your own sake. But my process really started when I became a mother. And then just slowly after that, there were, I've actually written him. I didn't feel like I could say it to his face for whatever reason. That was hard. So I've actually written him and told him, I forgive you for everything. And so, yes, there were declarative statements like that. And then also just after that, I would just say forgiveness is really an ongoing, process, especially when the wounds are really, really deep. So, those wounds rear their ugly head every once in a while. And you just have to be willing to say at that point, okay, I'm feeling this way, if you are spiritual, taking that to the Lord and letting him help you work through that, sharing it all with him, because he's ultimately the healer. And then just, working through that process maybe again. And it can be really painful, but just reminding yourself like, okay, I have forgiven him once. Maybe there's some ongoing pain. Maybe there's some things that I still need to forgive, and just, continuing to work through that process. So I think it's important to view it like not from like a one and done kind of thing, because it's really not that at all. It really is an ongoing process. And there have been memories then, that would come up and cause some pain again. And so then I just have to stop and, kind of process through those things. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with that's been my experience too with forgiveness. It's certainly like a messy process. I think I've talked on the show about some different advice from great wise mentors, and Yeah, I think, like you said, the definition I've kind of worked with of forgiveness is like it's this ongoing decision to release someone of a debt that you feel they owe you because of a wrong they committed against you. And kind of in that kind of rough definition is like ongoing, like you said, it's not one and done. Decision, meaning it's not a feeling, which we can get confused about it, thinking that one day when I feel it, I'll forgive them. Not that you need to force forgiveness, but I think it's certainly more of a decision than it is an emotion. Though there is, like you said, a lot of freedom that can come from it, but usually that's a byproduct. It's not what comes first. And then, and then just like when it comes to the justice component of it, I think often people are worried about letting people off the hook, or I don't know, kind of making perhaps maybe that forgiveness is allowing them to like get away with it and not, maybe be corrected or something like that, which definitely is a longer conversation. But I think there is a lot of beauty, especially if there's no harm being done further that needs to be stopped. Because in that situation, we'd say, no, there certainly should be that sort of justice. But I think there's something really good and beautiful about looking at forgiveness and mercy, which is it's rooted in as like going beyond justice. We're surpassing justice. We're going beyond it. We're not like neglecting it, because we have the right to maybe hurt this person back. We have the right to enforce, whatever justice is due. But going beyond it is certainly being the better person, being, it requires so much strength and virtue. It's not a weakness. It's not something that's like, I'm going to let you off the hook. It's no, I'm using all the strength within me to not, seek revenge.
Yeah. And I have to say, not that I want my dad to suffer. I don't. I mean, that's the very definition of love, willing the good of the other. I definitely, I want him to heal. I want him to feel released from all of that for sure. But as far as justice goes and, thinking about that, I can only imagine his pain, honestly, because he's missed out on, watching my family grow, getting to know my family, getting to know my kids. Those are his grandkids and he doesn't know them. And so as far as, justice goes, I am sure that he has suffered because of his choices. I have no doubt that he has. And I hope that, that he can let that go and feel that release and not continue to suffer.
If you know someone whose parents are separated or divorced, or maybe they're in the middle of the process right now, you probably want to help, but you're not quite sure what to do or say in order to help them. And if so, you're not alone. It's a really common struggle. That's why we created our free guide, 10 tips to help someone whose parents are separating or divorcing. It offers really practical, tactical things that you can do or say to help them, and especially to help them feel less alone, the top things to avoid saying or doing that might cause harm, and then what they need the most from you during this time. But most of all, the guide helps you feel competent and confident in offering help. And so get the free guide at restoredministry.com/10 tips, restoredministry.com/10 tips, either the number or the letters, or just click on the link in the show notes. Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And that's so merciful of you too, because like we were saying, I guess another definition of forgiveness could be kind of giving up our right to some form of revenge or some form of like getting that person back when they hurt us. Because we just naturally as humans want that. So I think that's really good. And it's really fascinating. Like obviously, speaking to especially our Catholic audience, we would say that, we do believe that in the end, like in the afterlife and in eternity, after the world ends, like there will be an accounting for all the good and the bad. So justice will be served. Should it be served on earth? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Justice should be served on earth. But we know especially that that's going to happen in the end. That's what we believe as Catholics. And so I think that often it's perhaps a little bit easier to give forgiveness in that situation, like let go of like, okay, I'm going to let go of this revenge I might want or this vindictive feeling or emotion. And then the point you made, which is also so true, that so often the dysfunction, the bad decisions, the bad habits are punishments in themselves. The misery that they lead to like truly is horrible and a form of, I guess we could say, a form of justice.
Yeah, because, forgiveness can be there, but we're never free from the consequences of our decisions. I mean, the consequences are there. I mean, so, good or bad.
Right. Yeah, there's certainly punishments in themselves in some ways, but it's so good. I know with the little time we have left, I'm curious, you shared a lot so far, but I'm curious if you would add anything additional when it came to healing. Like what else did you do? What else was really like helpful when it came to, bringing like healing and restoration, wholeness into your life?
Yeah. So again, the Holy Spirit's timing is amazing. A couple years back, we were just going through some other hard things in our family, and I had two very wise priests who visited with Dan and I and really spoke into our lives and gave us some really good tools. And they thought, this one particular priest, he's still our priest, he thought he was giving me this tool to help me through the current situation, but he had no idea how much it would help in healing in this situation. And that was the Restore the Glory podcast with, Dr. Bob and Jay Kim. And from that, I found the Abiding Together podcast. So I'm a little bit of a podcast junkie.
I love it.
So that's how I found your podcast initially. But I found a lot of healing through both of those podcasts, and then a lot of what Dr. Bob Schutz has written about healing. And so understanding the anatomy of a wound was huge for me. And that allowed me to go deeper than I'd really ever gone before. So where there was a lot of healing before, just, through my spiritual life and my walk with Christ, this allowed me to understand a little bit more about the psychological side of things, but yet also bringing in the spiritual component with it. And that was incredibly healing for me, and has been healing for my husband too. He also comes from a broken family. And so I think he's found a lot of healing also through what Dr. Bob Schutz and Jay Kim have done. And so, between those two podcasts, and then even just listening to yours, Joey, just to hear, it's so healing to hear people tell their story and to know you're not alone. That's huge.
Oh, I'm really happy that we've been able to help you. But no, I couldn't recommend those podcasts more. I haven't listened a ton to Abiding Together, but I've heard amazing things about it. And Sister Miriam has been on the show. We'll link to that podcast. Great show. Dr. Bob's been on multiple times. We did talk about the anatomy of the wound on the show, and so we'll link to that as well. And then, I was on their podcast, so we'll link to that if anyone's interested as well, because that was a really enjoyable conversation with them. But that makes so much sense. You mentioned therapy. I just want to touch on that briefly. Yeah. How was that helpful, and what type of therapy did you go through? Curious about all that.
I think mine must have just been cognitive behavioral therapy. When the divorce happened, my mom sought out help from a psychologist and used a lot of the things that she gained from that with me, which was wonderful. So sort of a little bit of an indirect therapy, I guess, if you will. And then when the abuse came out, my parents immediately put the whole family in counseling. And that was also very healing for that process. So then since then, I have done some therapy on my own. My husband and I have done some therapy together, and he's done some on his own. We live in a really small town. There aren't a lot of resources around here. My preference would probably, just because I am Catholic, to always find a Catholic counselor. Mainly just I want somebody who, their belief system aligns with my belief system. And the idea of bringing the spiritual component into the psychological realm, like we've talked about with Dr. Bob Schutz and Jay Kim, that's so powerful. To have the two come together. I've just never experienced healing like that. As an adult, went in search of a counselor who would incorporate, the spiritual side, and I didn't find a Catholic counselor here, but a Christian counselor, and she was good. Probably didn't go as far as I would have liked for her to go. I would love to do I'm EMDR and some of these other things that are more intense, but that's what I've had experience with here, locally, and it's been good.
Good. No, I'm happy. Was there anything else in terms of people in your life who helped you heal, or tools or tactics, content, anything like that before we move on?
Yeah. The Lord has been so gracious to give me really beautiful women in my life that I've been able, of course, my mom, we talked about my mom and being able to have open conversations with her. My grandmother, her mother, while she was alive, she's no longer living, but she had a huge impact on my life. And then my mom was the youngest of 8. So I have a number of aunts and uncles, and those relationships have also been really healing. So I've been really fortunate to have really strong adults in that regard. And then have had some beautiful women step into my life who were like my mentors at work as I came up through the education pipeline, who have now become one in particular. She's like a second mom to me, so to have that to lean on, and then have had some beautiful friendships with women who have, been through some similar trauma. And so it's just really healing to have people that can speak into your life, in a positive way, and who've maybe been through some of the same things. So I would assume it's the same for men. You need those people who you can relate to, and they can relate to you as well.
No, we could do it on our own. We don't need any help. No, absolutely. Yeah, it's so interesting to see the trend in all these, dozens and dozens of interviews we've done it's often like the same answer. It's really cool. Like love is healing, people are healing. And I wanted to highlight a little bit more. You already touched on this and we can go as deep as you want with it, but just like how healing your marriage has been, just your relationship with Dan. No marriage is without struggle. I know that personally, but there's so much good and beauty that can come from it. I know for me, like, yeah, marriage has been hard in some ways, but it's certainly made me maybe a better man. And, I'm really grateful for my wife and grateful for the marriage that we have. And so, yeah, I'm curious if you talk a little bit about that. You mentioned how just seeing him as a father was really helpful in healing, but yeah, what else would you mention?
It's so funny because as much as my mom was so good to have deep conversations with me about whatever, she's not really like physically affectionate. And so I didn't grow up a hugger. And then Dan, when I met Dan, he and his whole family are very like physically affectionate. So, it's been funny to kind of morph into this person who loves, hugs, long hugs and that sort of thing. And our kids are like that too. They love physical affection. So, even that, has been really healing, I think, for me. And then also just, yes, and you're right, no marriage is without struggle. It is a saint maker, to be sure. But I think so I know data would say that our statistics would say that Dan and I are like probably doomed because we both come from, broken families. I think it probably made us also both really resilient in marriage because we were both really just not willing to give up. So in the hard times, and we've had our fair share of really hard times, just like everybody else, we've just continually said to each other, like, it's not an option. So we need to go get help or, whatever we need to do, to make this work, to get over this hurdle. I will say, though, I think because we both come from broken families, we were not good communicators at all. I think we were afraid to have conflict, which I think is probably normal given both of our situations, because conflict, I think, to both of us signaled, there's a problem and maybe there's a divorce looming. And because we weren't willing to go there, we just weren't willing to have conflict, Yeah. And that was not healthy at all. So, I would say as your audience, as they are coming maybe from broken families and then moving into their own marriages, from the very beginning, just know conflict is okay. It's actually good, and find a good counselor or a good minister, somebody, a good mentor couple, somebody who can help you see conflict for the good and learn how to actually have conflict in a positive way, because we did not have those skills at all. I would say here we are a lot of years into marriage and we're still learning that. It's still really hard for us. We both really shy away from it. And I think it's just because, we're a product of marriages where conflict was really unhealthy and not resolved well, so yeah, but marriage has been healing for sure. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, I get that about like the whole fear of like conflict leads to permanent separation. So it's like better avoid that, but you can avoid the permanent separation and still dive into the conflict is the lesson that I'm hearing from you. Was there like one thing that helped you push into that a little bit more and just be willing to have that conflict? Like one skill, lesson, resource, something like that, if anyone's wondering. Dan and I went through a marriage retreat, if you will. It was an ongoing, it was retrovise, actually what it's called. We did that maybe 7 or 8 years ago. That was really good for us, sort of taught us how to have conversations where there was maybe some conflict and have those in a productive way. We also, I know you just interviewed JP DeGance. I also work through our parish with Communio. And so we've done a marriage retreat through our parish's relationship with Communio. That was excellent. They actually sent every couple away with like these little cards that like gave an actual like cadence to the conversation where there's conflict and like gave really helpful tools. So that was really beneficial. And I would just say, like, it's never ending. You need to keep learning. I think if there's ever a day where Dan and I like decide to quit learning about each other or how to have conversations with each other, we're probably in dangerous territory. So, marriage retreats, we had, I think I mentioned this, but 2 fabulous priests who really spoke into our marriage beautifully. One still does. He's still here. Yeah, all of that has been really helpful. And then some counseling that we did together was really helpful. And then we made it a point. We didn't do this when our kids were younger. I will tell on us. We were not good about date night. But, and I think that was not, people would tell us, oh, you need to be intentional about date night. We have 4 kids. We were busy. Yeah.
But we have made it a point. I mean, every Saturday night is date night for us. And our kids know that. And almost nothing comes in front of that. It's really rare that we give that up.
Beautiful.
And that just gives us, and we don't do anything fancy. It's usually just dinner out somewhere, and it's not even expensive, but it's just time alone to speak to each other. And we need to talk about. Sometimes it's not anything really important, and sometimes it is things that are really important.
No, so good. And I love how the date thing doesn't need to be complicated. That's a really good lesson there too. But one of the things just I want to convey too is all of these like problems that occur within marriages, there are solutions for. And it's not that you aren't capable, to anyone listening, it's not that you're not capable of handling conflict well. It's that you don't know how to handle conflict well. It's a skill deficiency. It's a virtue deficiency. And so you need to learn that skill just like any other skill, and then practice it. And with time, even though there's a lot of emotion involved in these things, so it might be harder, you can actually get better at it and perhaps even master it. And so I think that that's a really powerful lesson, because I think so often we think in like the black and white and binary, like you either have that ability or you don't. But it's like, no, it's actually just a continuum. It's like, how well do you handle conflict? Maybe not very well at all. And that's okay. That's where you're at. But you can learn to get better at handling conflict. But it's never like a switch on and off of like you handle conflict well or you don't handle conflict well, or you don't know how to or you do know how to. It's truly a continuum.
Yeah, you said it perfectly.
Awesome. So I could talk to you a lot more. One thing I was just going to mention to anyone wondering what the statistic is, it's 189% according to one study, 189% more likely to get divorced if you come from a divorced family, you marry someone who is also from a divorced family. So you're breaking stats there. I love it. Yeah. and that was at least one study that found it. And no, it's so beautiful to see people who are just flying in the face of that. So thank you. I know we've been talking for a while now. I just want to close off and say, if you could talk to your parents and have kind of an honest conversation with them to whatever degree you're comfortable, what would you say? What would you want them to know?
To my mother, I would just say thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'll get emotional talking about it. I just see her as really brave. Really brave. And she always put me first. And I'm just really grateful for that. To my dad, I would just say, I hope that you find peace and that you understand that there's nothing, I don't hold anything against you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for just sharing so vulnerably and for being an example of coming from a messy, broken situation and being able to build like a beautiful life and just become like a virtuous person. I look up to you in so many ways, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. So gosh, I'm sure we could talk more, but I just wanted to, say thank you. And I want to leave you with the final word. What final advice or encouragement would you give to the younger you out there listening right now?
You're not alone. One, you're not, there are other people struggling with all the same questions you have. And you can make it. You're not doomed. And I think I would just say to, open up, talk to people who love you, share things that you need to share. Don't hold it in. You don't have to be perfect all the time. Perfectionism and performance is not love. And, that there's healing on the other side.
That wraps up this episode. By the way, if you want to share your story with us like Brandy did, we'd love to hear it. And if you want, we can even post your story as an anonymous blog article on our website. You can go to restoredministry.com/story or just click on the link in the show notes to share your story. If this podcast has helped you, feel free to subscribe or follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. You'll avoid missing future episodes and help us reach more people. And if you've already done that, feel free to rate or review the show. We really appreciate that feedback, and that also helps people find the podcast. In closing, always remember you are not doomed to repeat your family's dysfunction. You can break that cycle and build a better life, and we are here to help. And keep in mind the words of C.S. Lewis, who said, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending.